everyone, this is JB with Excalibur Data Systems. Today our topic is business hours and how we might harness them to do really neat things. In particular, I'm going to show you an example of a configuration that was done to use business hours to help us control team notifications. Specifically, what action to take during business hours versus non-business hours, and how to set that up and make it spin. Three things then that are important to take away for today. One, setting custom field attributes on a business object. Two, setting up a simple way to associate those business hours to the business object in question. And then finally, three, creating a way to evaluate in a very binary fashion through an expression whether you fall within business hours or outside of business hours. I have on the screen here in the admin client the team info object, and for our work we've set up the business hours to be associated with the teams. I've created a field called business hours, and it's a text field and it's 30 characters long. It just has to be longer than the longest name that you're going to use for your business hours objects. Let's take a look at the field properties for business hours. Under Advanced, there's a section called Attributes. When we expand the general section of the attributes area, we find two attributes that have been specified for this field: custom list pop-up and custom list pop-up result. Now those two attributes are two general sounding attributes, but where the meat is for the purposes of our work today is really in the values that we associate with those attributes for this exercise. So because we want to, one, be able to go out and reference the business hours, and then two, be able to populate the name of the business hours object into the field, we utilize the value business hours manager, all one word, with the custom list pop-up attribute. And then for the second one, custom list pop-up result, we'll just use the value of name. We'll get that into the field and we'll publish that out. I've now gone over to the rich client and I've opened up this team record called sample team. And we have a form here and has some various information on it that's used for other purposes. But the two elements in particular now are this field called business hours and this button that's associated with it that's going to help us get at the actual business hours objects. Now, if this looks familiar, it is, because if you've used the system for any length of time, you've probably done the same thing over in the SLA Target Time object, which is associated ultimately with the parent SLA object. So if you were to navigate over into that area of a blueprint and take a look in particular at SLA Target Time, you'll see that this is configured exactly the same way as what Cherwell set it up for the purposes of managing time with respect to service level agreements. So now that we have this set up, I can just use this button here. And what I've done on the button is simply program that to take an action to show the legal values for the field in question. And when I click on that, it brings me up the business hours manager. So I have two of them in particular that I've created, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And these are just test records that I was using to mess around with. And I'm just going to select 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. again, that's already populated, but I'm going to save this record down. And now at this point, we've set the custom field attributes, and we've developed a way on the form to be able to now populate or associate a particular business hours record with, in this case, our team info object. I'm back over in the admin client, and I've opened up the automation processes area. I've highlighted on the screen one process in particular, notify team of assignment -incidents. This is where we really start getting into the meat of harnessing what we just configured on the team info object. If I edit that process, now for the purposes of our discussion, the steps that this automated process takes are really not applicable. We're not going to go into a bunch of detail here, but we're going to highlight one particular step in here, and that is called the step here where we're going to call a one step that's going to generate a team alert. And so I'm going to go out and I'm going to edit that particular one step. And here we have a one step that's really not on the surface terribly complicated. It does three things. One, it's going to evaluate whether or not the current time falls within the business hours or whether it falls outside of business hours. And then based on the return of that value, it's going to process a certain number of actions that are non-business hour based, or it's going to process a number of actions that are business hour based. So let's look at this business hours validity step. And we've programmed a condition here. So we need to ask the question, one, what time is it? And two, does that current date and time fit into business hours or non-business hours? So we do that by setting up an expression. And this expression is a date-time expression. And in particular, for that date-time expression, we're going to ask, is the current date and time, which I've specified here, is that a valid date and time, given the parameters that we're specifying down here in the calendar section? So you see a bunch of fields that are already set here. But I'm going to rewind just briefly to show you the difference between working hours and 24/7. If I select 24/7, I don't have any other options, and that's really a no-brainer. If we're selecting to operate on a 24/7 schedule, then we don't need to make any decisions about whether we fall inside of a certain time parameter or not. We're always in the time parameter, so it doesn't matter. But if I select working hours, well, now I'm back at where I have all of these different selections. And while you could do some things with the calendar, what we did here was we referenced our team info object and the field that we created on the team info object as the focal point for the scope. So I'm going to scroll down and select team info. There's the field called business hours, and now we've populated that in there. So now the expression will take the current date and time at whatever time that process is initiated. It will compare it to the business hours that are populated into that field. Now, in the case of our example, this is operating on a team-by-team level through a relationship that's been set up between incident and team info. So it's tying this all together is relating the information that we've gathered about the team for the incident and relating it directly to the information on the team info object. So we're tying together the owned by team ID to in incident to the team info ID to the team ID on the team info object. So what this gets us is every single time an incident is generated, it looks at the current date and time and the owned by team. And for that current date and time and for the business hours that have been specified for that team, whether or not the alert should behave within the parameters that we've specified that the team has declared are in their business hours versus what they've declared to be for outside their business hours. So you could use this for setting up something to say, hey, during the day, between the hours of 10 and 4, I only want to be emailed about the things that come in to our particular team. But at 4:01 and all the way till 9:59 the next morning, I want to be paged too. I want to get an SMS message. Well, that's exactly what this piece is doing here. And ultimately, it's allowing the teams to control how they're alerted and being able to manipulate at a granular level the time spaces that where they would like to be alerted a particular way. So as we wrap this up, 1, we've gone through setting the custom field attributes for the business hours, and then 2, creating a quick way to associate those business hours with the object. We do that on the form. And then finally, creating a mechanism for controlling the decision-making process. And when you're done, you have a very granular level of control, and you're able to turn over some of those decision-making processes to the teams themselves rather than having somebody central always managing those particular things. So I appreciate your time. This is JB from Excalibur Data Systems. Hope you have a great day.